All right, I think we have fiddled with everything enough. It's time to just get this video started. Oh yeah, books. This is what we're going to be talking about today. And by this, I don't mean a therapeutic journey. There are some things in this book I'd love to talk about in future videos, but we're going to be talking about books specifically, or books generally. Next week, we're going to be talking about audiobooks. I thought it'd be really fun to discuss and sort of explore the pros and cons of reading actual books versus audiobooks. And when I say reading actual books, I would say that something like this is a Kindle, or any other e-reader. I would put that on the same page for the purpose of this video as reading an actual book. The big thing is the difference between reading a book versus listening to a book. So this is going to be a two-part subject. So today we're just going to talk about the pros and cons of books. And then next week, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of audiobooks. I personally consume both at quite a high volume. In the last year, I've listened to 38 audiobooks, and I have read 13 actual books. As you no doubt noticed, the volume of audiobooks was about 3 times higher than the volume of actual books. And one of the reasons, which we'll get into more later, is with an actual book, you can't really multitask while you're reading it, but with an audiobook, it's sort of specifically designed for multitasking, which is one of the pros of it. Like I said, we'll discuss that more next week. Just to give a little bit of background, I used to be a really huge reader when I was a kid and into my teenage years and even the beginning of my 20s. And I really thank my mom for getting me into reading when I was a kid. I still remember this quite well. At some point when I was probably 7 or 8, I did something bad. I can't remember exactly what, but my parents grounded me, and they basically forbade me from engaging in any sort of digital entertainment. So basically no video games, no movies, no TV. Smartphones weren't really a thing then. Yes, I'm that old. So that wasn't really something that they had to take away. So pretty much the only option left for entertainment was books, and she provided those in plenty for something to go to during this time of being grounded. And that was definitely the catalyst for me falling in love with reading. This video is going to be a little bit different than my last couple videos because while I still will be providing some really subjective and kind of anecdotal personal opinions and experiences with reading and audiobooks, I really wanted to actually take the time to do some research and look up some scientific studies and read some articles and try to gather some opinions from professionals that have studied some of the benefits or lack thereof of reading an audiobook. So you will hear me cite some sources. For any of the sources that I cite today, there will be links in the video description. So if you want to learn more about any of this stuff that I discovered, or want to verify what I'm saying, or just kind of find out for yourself, feel free to look there for more information. Let's get started with the pros. And these are arranged in no particular order, so don't put any stock into that about one pro necessarily carrying any more weight than another. I'll just kind of present them as I wrote them here, and you can decide for yourself which ones resonate with you the most. The first one is reading is a great way to improve your communication skills and enhance your vocabulary. This was quite a fun one to do some research on, and I was actually inspired by a clip that I came across on a YouTube short for this particular pro. I will also have a link for that in the video description. But quite interestingly, the way the brain experiences and executes reading is very similar to and related to the parts of our brain that we use for communication and language and speaking. In fact, when we read books, we typically subconsciously say the words in our head. And I specifically differentiate saying in our head versus reading because we go through the experience of the exercise of sounding words out in our head. And you might notice this in particular, it might go from subconscious to conscious when you encounter a word you're not familiar with in a book and you try to sound it out in your head. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. This is a very common thing people do, though. You may notice it next time you're reading and you encounter such a word, but you'll actually attempt to pronunciate the word just like you would in real life if you were speaking out loud, trying to work out a word. While I was researching this video, I found a really interesting interview with Dr. Eddie Chang, who is a neurosurgeon and a professor of neurosurgery at the University of California. I discovered from this interview that for most of us, when we are reading, we actually say the words as we're reading, not just in our heads, but we actually physically say them with our vocal cords, just at such a infinitesimal, tiny little level that's imperceptible. It's generally subconscious. We don't even notice it. We can't hear it. No one else can hear it. But if you were to put the right device that could really record sensitive sounds and vibrations right up to your throat when you're reading, it would actually be able to pick up the rhythm and the syllables of the words as you're reading them. And in fact, this brings to mind times when I've seen people reading, and sometimes you can see their lips moving a little bit even as they're reading. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but I've noticed that from a few people. As I mentioned before, reading is a great way to enhance your vocabulary. This is verified by a study that I found published in the National Library of Medicine. I know in my own experience that almost always when I'm reading, I will encounter a word that I either don't know or sort of forgot I knew, but it's a word that isn't necessarily used a ton in modern language. And I feel like compared to reading, especially the kind of books I read, modern language tends to be much more efficient and not so nuanced. But I think it can give you a bit of a communication edge to have an expanded vocabulary and to be able to communicate with people using that expanded vocabulary. Expanding our vocabulary through reading not only can enhance your ability to communicate with other people, to communicate your thoughts and ideas, but it can actually help change the way that you think. And this is scratching the surface of a subject called NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming, which I'm not going to get into right now. I might do a video in the future because I have done a therapy in the past that is centered in neuro-linguistic programming. But essentially the gist of it, and what I mean by vocabulary can change the way we think, is that generally we think in words. Even when we're not reading, we think in words. We have an inner monologue, or perhaps even an inner dialogue going in our head all the time. And we tend to tell ourselves stories as we're experiencing through life, or when we're recalling a memory, or when we're feeling something, especially like a really strong feeling. We tell ourselves a story about how we feel, about why we feel, about what happened to us yesterday, about what we're planning to do tomorrow, about things we want, things we aspire to. And because we use actual words in our heads to think, we are limited in a sense by the amount of words we know. So for example, if you feel love and you only know about 3 words that have anything to do with love, you're going to have a hard time articulating, even to your own self, the depth of your feeling and what it means to you and how it actually makes you feel being in love or experiencing love. But by enhancing and adding to your vocabulary, you can actually tell yourself a more nuanced and detailed story about how you feel and explore that within yourself. Moving on to number 2 in the pros list. Reading is a great way to take a break from the constant multitasking and overstimulating life that most of us have nowadays. And it can also be very useful for reducing stress. I think now more than ever in human history, we have so many options available to us at all times for entertainment and stimulation, mostly thanks to our cell phones. And what this generally leads to, at least for me, but I think for a lot of other people, is that at almost every waking moment, we're doing at least 2 things at once. And what does that look like? Well, for me, when I wake up, the first thing I do is go to the restroom and weigh myself and brush my teeth. And typically, before I start any of that, I put music on, or an audiobook, or a podcast. So right away, at any given moment, from using the toilet in the morning to weighing myself to brushing my teeth, I'm doing that simultaneously while doing something else, while doing at least another thing. And we tend to have something going on in the background that's occupying part of our mind while we're doing another thing almost all the time, while we're driving, while we're cooking, cleaning, working. Even sometimes when we're spending time with our loved ones, we may be looking at our phones, we may be listening to something in the background, we may have the TV on in the background or in the foreground. And I wouldn't say something so black and white as to say that that is bad inherently, but I do feel quite strongly that it is good to get a break from that sometimes, especially later in the day when you're winding down and getting ready to go to bed. Now, clearly this level of multitasking can be really useful because, as I mentioned at the start of the video, in the last year I've listened to 38 audiobooks. And the only reason I've been able to do that is because I'm listening to audiobooks while I'm on a walk and while I'm driving. Those are typically the two biggest times. But sometimes I'll do it when I'm just kind of puttering around the house, doing some cleaning or something like that as well. Now, when you're reading an actual book, you really can't multitask, at least not safely. I know there are some people that read a real book while they're walking or even while they're driving, which is absolutely horrifying. Typically, generally, and safely, when you're reading, all you can do is read. And this can make it really hard to get into reading if you're not in the habit, if you're not in the flow, like if you're so used to doing at least two things at once. It can be very difficult to just stop and just do that. I suppose now that I mention it, and I didn't have this written in my notes, but you could theoretically listen to music while you're reading, and I have definitely done that in the past. So I just had to throw that out there for fair mention. But generally speaking, I still think it holds true in the spirit of what I'm trying to say, which is you really can't read a book while you're cleaning your house or while you're on a walk or while you're working. And this has been shown to have a dramatic increase on stress reduction. Just reading in general doesn't really matter what you're reading, apparently, but reading leads to stress reduction. Much more so even than things that we typically go to for stress reduction, like listening to our favorite song or going on a walk. By the way, that was evidenced by a study done by Dr. Lewis at the University of Sussex. And I do have to do an interesting side note on this study, which is that when I was researching this video, I found dozens of articles and blogs having to do with reading and stress and multitasking that all reference this study. But no matter where I looked, I could not find the actual study. I just found it referenced and cited in so many places, but I did decide to include it here myself because it was cited by many reputable sources. So I assume it is out there. Perhaps I'm just not good at finding it. Pro 3, reading a book is really good for falling asleep. A study published in the National Library of Medicine shows that reading for at least 15 to 30 minutes just prior to going to sleep leads to improved sleep quality and much less sleep disturbance. This was a self-reported study, but it was a very large sample size and seems quite reliable. I know for me, one of my favorite times to read is when I've laid down in bed and I'm trying to wind down my mind and get ready for sleep. And I think it's a far superior way to wind down as compared to the usual things that most people tend to do when they're trying to wind down in bed, which are typically watching a show or movie or scrolling mindlessly on social media. Now, why is that? Well, there may be several reasons, but the most immediately apparent one when comparing reading to looking at your phone or looking at the TV while you're in bed trying to fall asleep is that bright lights in your eyes, especially at night, they do two things that can negatively impact your ability to fall asleep and to stay asleep. And that is they can raise your cortisol levels and they can inhibit your ability to produce melatonin. A practical side note when comparing reading a book versus listening to an audiobook when you're getting ready to fall asleep is that when you're reading a book, falling asleep, you really can't lose your spot because you just read until you fall asleep and then you're done reading. Whereas an audiobook, and I've done this many, many times, but you put it on while you're trying to fall asleep, and then you fall asleep while the audiobook is still playing, and then you wake up at some point in the middle of the night. For me, it's usually around 3 or 4 in the morning when the voice actor for the book is getting a little bit too excited about their job. Then I'm like, I have no idea what's going on in the book, but I'll stop it, and I'll try to figure it out tomorrow. And then sure enough, when I queue up the audiobook the next day, I have no idea what's going on in the book, and it takes quite a bit of trial and error to find where exactly I fell asleep so that I can resume the story properly. This next pro is more of a musing. I didn't really do any research on this one, but it's something that I found for me that I find quite interesting, and I wanted to sort of explore with you guys. Reading is a great way to explore and challenge your perceptions in a safe, non-conflict setting that you can control the pace of. Think about a particular stance you might have on a controversial topic like religion or politics or human rights, and then imagine yourself in a scenario, which I think we've all been in, where you're having a conversation, maybe it's at a holiday meal with a close family member or friend, and this topic comes up and you find out that you're on the opposing side of this topic. And these situations can be quite abrasive, they can be stressful, they can affect your relationship with those people, can also make you and the people around you that aren't even involved in the conversation quite uncomfortable, and can potentially even ruin the event that you're at if you get too heated about it. And I think it's very easy in these situations when we're in person talking about something controversial with another person to really get defensive and to get our fight or flight systems engaged. Now, when you compare that with reading a book that you might accidentally come across a stance or reference to a topic that you're on the opposite side of, or maybe you want to explore and actually pick up a book that's specifically about the opposing side of something that you believe in, this can really be a great way to explore, to get a more well-rounded perspective on this topic or issue by looking at the other side in a way that's really safe. When you're reading a book, you're really safe. You can't get in a fight with a book. The book is not going to hurt you. You're not going to lose your friendship with a book because the book does not have feelings. It's just words on a page. So if you hate it, you can stop and you might cool down and come back to it, or you might just decide that book's not for you, and no harm, no foul. The next pro I have on the list is that reading a book is a great way to nourish your inspiration and creativity. And I feel like this is particularly true when reading fictional books, especially in the genres of sci-fi and fantasy, although maybe that's just me. But reading in these genres can really help you escape, at least in your mind for a little while, the box of mundane realism that we often find ourselves in. Now, this is not to say that the real world outside of a fantasy or sci-fi book is not amazing and full of wonder and opportunity and mystery. It certainly is. But we oftentimes get really stuck in our day-to-day routine, and we sort of keep our thoughts and intentions within that spectrum. And sometimes when we get our mind open by reading a fantasy or a sci-fi book or a fictional book, it can really inspire us to look at the real world with a new sense of wonder and to realize how much you don't know about it, what you haven't seen, and it can inspire you to go and have some adventure. Reading regularly tends to inspire you in the sense that when you're reading lots of books, you're digesting endless words and endless combinations of words from other people's minds and their stories. And each one of us will individually gravitate towards or resonate with particular words and themes and sub-stories within the books that we read. This singular way that we each have of digesting books can help us develop our own unique creative style and ways of expressing ourselves, either through writing or through speaking. The last pro, but certainly not the least, is that books make a really nice, personal, nostalgic gift. Sometimes when I'm having a one-on-one conversation with someone, especially if it's a really deep, introspective conversation, like we're really getting into something interesting, exploring something that inspires us or that causes us anxiety or stress or just heavy feelings of any kind, my conversation partner will say something or introduce an idea that really resonates all of a sudden with a particular book that I've read, and I get really inspired to share that book with them. And I've typically done this in the past without too much thought, but while exploring this deeply and introspecting about it for the purpose of this video, I feel that this gifting of books in these circumstances is a way to convey to the recipient of the gift that you really heard them when they were talking to you. It's a way of saying, I see you, I hear you, and the feelings that you gave me with your story reminded me of the feelings I got when I read this book. And because of that intersection, I think this might really resonate with you as well. And I think that subconscious message of really seeing and hearing and listening is more the gift than the actual physical book itself, if that makes sense. Now that we've covered a handful of pros, let's go over some of the cons of reading actual books. Truthfully, I really don't think there are many cons of reading books, but I did want to prepare a few in a bid to have a well-rounded overview of the subject. The first con could really be a pro, depending on your perspective, but that is the time consumption and the opportunity cost of reading. And this is a con because, as we established earlier, reading is really not an activity that you can multitask during, which inherently means that anytime you're reading, it means you're not doing something else because all you can do is the reading. So there's an opportunity cost every time you're reading. That said, a Forbes article citing data collected from SimilarWeb shows that the average American is spending at least 68 minutes a day on social media. So that's a little over an hour. So I think most of us could find at least a half an hour a day to read. And if you're going to do that at any time, perhaps consider doing that right before you go to bed due to the reasons that we discussed earlier. Now, the second con is actually sleep interruption, which I know is sort of directly in violation with the con I mentioned earlier that reading helps you fall asleep. But I know for myself and for any really big readers out there, occasionally you will find a book, and it's usually a story, not educational content, that you get so sucked into, so engrossed into, that you just can't put it down, especially when you're nearing the climax of a book. And it's not uncommon in these circumstances to lay down for bed, start reading around 9 p.m., and keep going until 3, 4, 5 p.m. I've done this many times in the past, fortunately not back to back, but obviously in this case, you're robbing yourself from most of the time that you had to sleep. Now, while this point is entirely experiential and anecdotal on my part, I do feel that the experience of getting that sucked into a book that you really love, that you lose a whole night's sleep, is such an amazing feeling and such a great experience that I think the reward is worth the cost. As long as it's not the night before a really important event or a work presentation or something, and as long as you're not doing it multiple nights in a row where you're really messing up your week. Another con that can also sometimes be a pro, depending on the circumstance, is the escapism that you can find in certain types of books. And I find for me that this escapism tends to be in fantasy books, but when you get really into a book, you can really sort of transport yourself into that reality, into that story, and really let go of your real life, at least while you're reading it. And this can be quite an amazing experience. It can be a really positive thing. It can be a great thing to do if you're having a brief period in your life where you're feeling lonely or isolated or stressed out or riddled with anxiety, and you just want to escape into a beautiful story, something that can take your mind off of it. But I do think that there's a potential for this escapism becoming kind of a crutch that can prevent you from facing and dealing with bigger life problems and potential lifestyle changes you might need to make that are prompting you to want to escape from your reality in the first place. That said, as a form of self-medication, this is probably one of the least harmful ways to medicate yourself, especially compared to substance abuse like alcohol and drugs. The final con I wanted to discuss is the potential harm that certain types of books, especially fiction books, can cause by giving you unrealistic expectations of reality, your life purpose, and relationships. Most of the most popular fiction books out there, and even the movies and television we watch today, all center around a narrative device called the hero's journey, which was popularly identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-1900s. The hero's journey, essentially, is the idea that each one of us has some great, magnificent sense of purpose or destiny that we were made for, that we were designed for, that's just out there waiting for us to find it. And I think a lot of us have this hole in our soul or our heart where we feel like sometimes we're just sort of daydreaming through life or just going through the motions, and we get really drawn to these superhero movies and these stories about ordinary people being called to do extraordinary things and returning back victorious and stronger and wiser, wealthier, and we feel like we're meant for something similar. Now, the hero's journey and how it relates to real life is a subject that's been explored by quite a few interesting people on other YouTube channels. I've seen some people discuss this, talking about the danger of the idea of the hero's journey and that there is no hero's journey, that it's not a real thing, it's not something we should be looking for or aspiring to. I've seen other people make an argument that we do each have our own hero's journey, but that it rarely looks as fantastical and dramatic as it does in film, television, and books. But we do have to be careful when we're consuming amazing stories, amazing books, especially fiction ones, especially those ones that we get so sucked into that we stay up all night reading it, that we don't lose touch with and we don't lose perspective on our own life and what we can do and all that there is to be thankful for, and the wonder and joy and sense of purpose and fulfillment that can be found within the stuff that's right in front of us that we may be taking for granted because there isn't a giant scary monster that we have to find a magical sword to go fight, and then we win the love of the person that had never noticed before, and we find treasure and never have to worry about money again or any of that stuff. And the other distortion of reality that we can sometimes get from books, especially fiction books, especially romantic novels, is we can get a really unrealistic perspective on relationships, what realistic relationships look like, what healthy relationships look like, what love looks like. And we need to just keep in the back of our head while we're consuming this content that this is really idealized content. It's meant to entertain. It's not meant to represent realism. But that said, I feel strongly that we get the same sense of unrealistic expectation about life and the hero's journey and about love from social media and movies and television as well. And books are still probably the more benign out of all of those in terms of consumption. So just bear in mind that it's not real, enjoy it, but don't let that rob you of your ability to participate and function in real life and have real relationships and a real sense of purpose in your own journey. In conclusion, in case it wasn't obvious from the pros and cons that I listed, I think and feel that reading is a really good thing that everyone should be doing. It's inspiring. It's creative. It's a way to play with reality. It's a way to escape from yours. It's a way to inspire you to go out and to make new relationships, to communicate better, to think better, to be more healthy, to reduce your stress, to fall asleep easier. And it's also one of the oldest ways we have of preserving human ideas, with the oldest evidence of written language we found being over 5,000 years old, which is absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for watching. This was episode 4 of Vagabond Vox. And as I mentioned, this was a 2-part episode. Next week, we're going to be doing a very similar video today, but we're going to be talking about audiobooks. Thank you so much. See you next time.